So before we get started, the monitor is, here. So does everybody have a way to see it? Because shift your chair maybe, move, there's like space on the edges or something, because I think, it's smallish. Yeah? Everybody can see? Okay. Okay, good. Well, welcome to, my talk about a space becomes an entry. And yeah, you got a chair there? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so let's see. I thought I'd talk about what are they first and get that part clear, because that's always the questions that everybody has at the beginning. So they're digital collage, and so I'm going to deconstruct this one a little bit for you. So I'm working with my own photographs. I really do consider myself a photographer first and foremost. I have a lot of different threads in my art practice, but I'm a prolific shooter and carry my camera everywhere with me, and I shoot all kinds of things. The collages are one part of what the work ends up as. So that's the photograph that I took originally, and what interested me about that space was this, this big arc of this yellow piece of equipment. And so what I do is I start with a blank piece of paper. So in Adobe Photoshop, I go to my little file that has scanned in pieces of paper, and I put a piece of paper on the surface of the computer. And then basically, I start pulling things in and putting them on top of that piece of paper. And so, in a lot of cases, I'm pulling parts of things. So I took this from the final image. So I'm going to take this apart a little bit for you. When you look at, whoops, I keep pushing the other button. I got to get used to this. When you look at the original photograph, you can see that there's parts of it that are really quite heavy and dark in the beginning. And so those things really pull your eye away from the thing I want you to be, seeing, this big arc here and, that kind of movement there. So what I do is I cut them out, and so then I've softened them a lot. I've made them black and white, I've made them a little bit transparent, and you can see how that makes the space, act differently. And so this is what I love about working digitally, as opposed to just, gluing things together, is in Photoshop, I can make things transparent. I can make things a different color. I can, make them smaller, bigger. And so there's just so many more possibilities when you start putting things together in this way. So this would have been the stuff that's, on other layers. They usually have many layers. And so I've got a background here and then some bits of some collage things. And I put this extra traffic light string because I'm trying to create movement in these spaces, and any kind of diagonal lines are always really good for movement. And then there's just ways of unifying. So there's a little bit of blue lines down here to unify that blue thing up there. It's a lot of principles of art that come into it. So what am I working with? This is a screenshot. So I have all these folders on my computer of things I've scanned into the computer. And one of the things I've scanned in is just cut paper and torn paper collages, which is kind of a whole other thing that I like to do as part of my practice. Sometimes I'll just do that, and that's all it is. And I'll use paint around the edges. And so I want you to look at this one here. You see how that beige edge there, that is the sky of that image. I sometimes will just take a little piece of the collage. And so I use collage, wait, where am I going? This one, I keep going back and forth. Yeah, so these are some of the analog, or cut paper, I don't know why I say analog, cut paper, torn paper, and the one on the right has some silkscreen also. I had this little foray into the silkscreen world, which I've now abandoned, but it was really fun to take the silkscreen and just make little squares of silkscreen ink all over the top of my collages, and I've been using those things a lot when I go into the collage folder and pull things out. I've scanned in sketchy drawings, and then just other things like colored pencil lines or I'll sometimes deliberately make something that I think could maybe look like a cloud in the sky. Or this one in the middle I put because this is just another screenshot, a little piece of that folder. I have tons of stuff in these folders. That was a wall in Portland I shot a number of years ago, this middle one. And I guess somebody had tagged things, and so then they painted over it. These brown things, I have used these so many times in my collages now. It's really funny. But I mean, I do have my favorite things. It's lots of fun layering all this stuff and seeing what things will happen. I also have folders of pieces of buildings, pieces of construction stuff. So it's just like the way somebody would work in cut paper collage, but I'm having to go digitally into these places, which is why I love the latest versions of Adobe Photoshop, which have multiple tabs that you can have open in Bridge at the same time, and that really is helpful for me. I know that some people would find this an overwhelming thing, but I tend to work on more than one collage at a time. So I'll have a couple of pieces of paper with a building, and then I go into the folders, and maybe something comes into this that has a different mood than that. And so I go back and forth a lot. And for some reason, I enjoy this. Like, my mind enjoys all these different stimulating, combinations of things. So this image on the wall there, this is Palm Springs. And so I've gotten rid of the sky right off the bat because it's just so dominant in that picture. I'm just going to go through this. And so this is kind of a little bit what it would look like on some of the other layers. And so you see I've cut that mountain out. And the reason is because sometimes I'll cut it apart and make part of it a little bit transparent, because then it blends better with the background. So if I hadn't made this, it would have been too white because the white paper, so I don't know, it's complicated. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, I think that there's a little bit of defensiveness about working digitally, because I think people, for a long time, have a preference of, something that's like physically paper, and digital is suspect. I think people maybe think you just push a button or something. I'm not just pushing a button, and there are really good reasons why it's compelling to work in this digital collage way, just the amount of things that you can do to change it. There is one part of the process where I actually get a colored pencil. At the end, I have a printer at home, so I print things if they're small enough. I pay somebody to print the big things. But it's always, at the end, I take this colored pencil and just kind of go back over the whole thing and maybe freshen up a little bit at the edges, like make it a little darker at an edge just to emphasize things a bit more. Or I'll take a pencil and kind of extend a line so it looks a little bit more it's all lines that I've drawn originally, but I do a little bit of handwork at the end. Not so much that it would change the picture, because I've spent hours in the computer making it the way it is, but just a little bit of, bringing it out. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what they're not. They are not portraits of cities, in my opinion. So this is all images from Montreal. But I'm not even sure if someone from Montreal would look at this and think that, it's Montreal. And what I think about these collages more is that they're more about the idea of a city, not a particular city, just sort of the way that cities have energy and a certain kind of forward momentum. And I like the word dynamism about the way that urban space feels to me. And that's why I think about movement all the time when I'm putting these collages together, trying to create that sense of the rhythm and movement of a city. And I thought I'd maybe talk about how that came to be in my life, that I have this kind of positive view of urban living. And that's because I spent most of my life living in the suburbs. I grew up in this house on the top in Pennsylvania. I'm from around the suburbs of Philadelphia, a town called Doylestown, where I grew up. And then years later, lived in suburb of Providence, Rhode Island for a number of years. and lived in Linwood, Washington for a good long time, which was where I taught public high school. And so I was teaching photography, and when I first started, it was all darkroom photography. So I had 5 classes of 30 kids a day in and out of the darkroom. And then by the time I left, it was all digital for the most part. I had advanced students still doing it, darkroom work, but when I retired, the person they hired didn't, it was the end of it. So I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia about the darkroom part of it because of all those years of teaching, and this picture makes me laugh. It's a little too small for you to see, but I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia for those 20 years of teaching, although I loved it. It's hard work. It's really hard work, and that's what a group of seniors look like when you have them in the classroom before 8 o'clock in the morning. And, so at that time in my life, I was shooting a lot of landscape photographs, and I think, I was looking for peace and quiet, so I would go out and drive around on the weekends and just, find these trees and quiet things. So it was quite a big shift for me when I retired and met my husband, Wolfgang, who's German-Canadian, and so moved to Canada and started going to Europe once a year and traveling to visit his family. And while I was in Europe, I started shooting street photography, which I never really had done until that point. And so it really changed my photography at that point, because living in a city, Vancouver, I was able to just walk around downtown and take photographs. And so I joined a photo meetup, and it was the kind of group where you met once a month and brought your project in. You had to have a year-long project. And so I had decided that my project was going to be to shoot the city of Vancouver in the same way that I was shooting these travel photographs. And so when I look at the work I did during that period, I can see a real straight progression through everything I'm doing. This is why I'm showing you these earlier bodies of work, because it's all, I feel, related. And so these early street shots, I'd become comfortable with shooting in, the environment, a lot of big walls, small figures. I wasn't really trying to do the kind of documentary where you get close to people. And I was really interested in just the gesture of the people. And so to me, the city was a place where there was lots of opportunity, and I never felt that these pictures with these big walls and these small people were about alienation. Although I think there are people that whenever they see a big wall and a small person, they think that, it's about feeling alienated in the urban environment. I always felt that the pictures were about, people being side by side in an urban space, and everybody comfortably going about their own business and sort of recognizing in each other the same gestures and, feeling like together, even though we were all apart in the space. And so I started incorporating bits of collage in there more or less to emphasize the gestures. I wanted people's eye to be going, where the figures are, and so more simplifying the background space. Those are really quite simple. This, at street level, I had a series called That. And at the same time I'm doing this, I'm exploring all these different ways to use collage with the photographs. And I did a series called In the Leeway, which was photographs of my husband and me, sort of silhouetted figures of us, and there was a poem that went with it, and it had to do with us having differences in our personalities and sort of the mysteriousness of how a relationship works when people have different, things. And I thought the silhouetted figures sort of suggested that. And so that series was actually here in the drawers a number of years ago, as was this one. And this is my pandemic series. Again, during the pandemic, I really got more into the collage part and more adventurous in terms of how I was using the collage with the images. and these were mostly self-portraits. And then when I went back to doing the street photography, I was really concentrating more on, this idea of together apart. And so I did a series called We Were Neither Here Nor There, and those were all, people in the space together, but going about their business, comfortably apart. And so the one on the left is actually from two different, I don't know if it's left or right for you, I guess it's left, yeah. That's two different images, and sometimes I would do that, put a figure from one place or another. It was important to me always that these were actual figures. I was never telling somebody, oh, walk over here and do this thing. Like that sense that there was a moment in there that I had taken a picture of was important to me. I don't know how important it would be to, I don't know how important that is overall, whether it was just important to me or if it's important overall, but I really love that aspect of street photography where, it's this thing where you've grabbed hold of a piece of the world, right? And so the one on the right actually did happen. There were two people walking down the street in, I think it was Tokyo, in opposite directions that looked exactly the same. And so that was exciting to have taken that picture. And so the whole time I'm shooting these pictures, I'm doing straight photography, and I belong to a street photography collective in Vancouver, so I have sometimes showing straight photography in the group shows of the collective and things like this. But the thing about street photography that I think, well, there's a lot of things that I love about street photography, but it's really hard, those of you who do street photography, this, to not only have everything happening in the background that works, but to have that gesture be the right thing and be at that moment. And so many, many pictures get taken before you get the one that actually works. And both of these two, I don't know how well you can see that with the small screen, but I was responding to something. I just had my camera and I was quick enough. I lifted it up and took the picture. But that wasn't usually the way it worked for me. Usually street photography for me worked where I would be standing in a space waiting for somebody to come into the space. And those of you who do street photography, you're familiar with this way of doing it. And often you're standing there for a long time. And so I had, I was shooting all those pictures of the interesting space. And I had them, but I didn't feel like they were interesting enough. They weren't enough that they could be hanging on a wall by themselves. So I was making these little books. So bookmaking is another thread in my practice. I've done a lot of handmade books, many actually, of my photographs. And so I was taking these architectural photographs and using them in that way. And then I was reading a lot about architecture at this time. I have no background in architecture whatsoever, and really, never really thought about it too much. Until, my retirement, where I have time to think about things. Being retired gives me lots of time to do research and think about things. And so I was reading about architecture, and I came across this photograph. It's by Luigi Ghiri, who is one of my absolute favorite photographers. And it's the cemetery at Modena, this little building here, which was designed by the architect Aldo Rossi. And I was reading Aldo Rossi's autobiography, and the things he said about architecture made me start thinking about my photographs of architecture in a different way, because he really believed that architecture was a search for meaning, that it was something that had to do with intangible longings. And he talked a lot about how when we view architecture, we're viewing it through a prism of our memories and associations. And I started thinking about how I could take my architectural photographs and use them, especially with collage, this whole idea of the fragmented perception of things. And so he was a huge inspiration for me. And in fact, Wolfgang and I went on a pilgrimage to see Aldo Rossi buildings in Italy. We plotted them out, many around Bologna. And this cemetery is an amazing place. This is actually a crypt. If you go through those doorways, you'll see walls where the bodies are, behind, there was plaques and little vases and walls and walls. They're like 4 stories high of the body part of the crypt, but it's also part of a huge complex. There's multiple buildings. Has anybody been there besides me? It's fantastic. It's right outside of Bologna. I'm not sure if public transportation gets you there, but when we got there, we were the only people in the whole complex, which was a really amazing experience. Anyway, these quotes by Aldo Rossi, I really liked. It'll give you a sense of the way he writes. And I have to preface this also too with, I've talked to architects and said that, I'm this huge Aldo Rossi fan, and a lot of architects, they don't respond in the way I would think they would. He's not every architect's favorite architect, and I'm not sure what that is about. Maybe because he didn't build as many buildings as he, planned, and he had a lot of ideas, but I like his ideas. And so he wrote, I realized that I had simply recounted through architecture certain mornings when I had read the newspaper in the great Lichthof of the University of Zurich. And he also said, it was not architecture specifically that interested me, and still isn't, but rather the emotion that architecture, despite its limits, seemed to give to me. So the other thing about Aldo Rossi that I fell in love with, besides these ideas he had, is his drawings. And his drawings are fantastic. And there are books of these things that you can get easily. And you can see a real connection, I think, between these architectural drawings and this body of work that developed out of, me looking at this stuff, which I titled this body of work, If We Were to Talk About Architecture, because I was thinking about it being kind of a dialogue between me and Aldo Rossi, because I was taking all these notes from, his books and looking at it at the time. So yeah, that's the beginning of that series. And in this photograph, there are multiple cities. There's a bit of Munich, there's Tokyo, there's lots of Vancouver. And this one still has a figure. At that point, I'm kind of transitioning into this idea that maybe I could just, use the buildings, but I was still, some of them, that body of work has kind of mixed. Some still have figures. And this one here, this is Berlin, and then Munich, and then the dog park in Vancouver. And so this idea of pulling multiple things in, Aldo Rossi did this as well. He had a series of work called Fragments, and he was doing drawings where he would draw from different cities. And he's not the only one who has done this. I later discovered that Edward Hopper, when he was doing some paintings, would sometimes take different parts of the city and use them in his paintings. And the way I discovered that is because I was reading about Wayne Thibault and his landscapes. I have one in the slideshow I'll show you in a minute. But it was a big revelation to him when he found that Edward Hopper had been doing that, and then he started to do it. So, I mean, this is not, I'm not doing anything that other people haven't done here. Here's a few from that architecture series that don't have the figures as well. And yeah, Vancouver, those orange buildings, I walk past them every day, all the time. And then the one on the right is my brother's hometown in Pennsylvania. And it really is evocative to me of my childhood, these kinds of sturdy square buildings. And that one's kind of merged with a building from Vancouver that I used that transparency option again, and the two of them just sort of blended well. And then, to refine it, I went and got a bit of a bridge from, I don't know, somewhere in Portugal, I think. And this one, okay, so I want to talk also a little bit about just the way photography has enhanced my life. And so when we travel, we often will go to Google search and look up interesting architecture in the places we're going, and that'll get you some interesting places. And so when we were in Kanazawa in Japan, we ended up in this library that was like outside the main city, and it's the building here on the right, this polka dot building. Every one of those polka dots is a window, and you go into the library and the light is just pouring in there. It's really crazy. But it was there are not many tourists that go there, so when we got there, they had just this big pile of paperwork we had to fill out, and it was just quite a thing to get, permission to go with a camera inside there. I was so nervous I didn't take any pictures inside, really. I mean, they were bad, the ones I took. But I always liked that outside part, and so again, you'll see that bit of that one collage, the same shape that was in the other image, which I guess is in the back. It's appearing again here, that same little outer edge of that one paper collage, if you're interested in that. So photography has brought me to all kinds of places that I might not have, gotten to if I wasn't trying to walk around with my camera, streets of Istanbul at 5 in the morning, things like this. But it's also made me really appreciative of what I see just around the corner in my neighborhood. And so, I take my camera out with me whenever I leave the condo, and I have it, handy, and I collect little pieces of things. Sometimes nothing happens with those pictures, but this one I had sitting there for a while, and it was like a piece of sculpture to me, this little arrangement of the cone and the back of the sign. And eventually I started playing around with those construction images, and so that red fence and all that other stuff, that's right around the corner from where I live. There's an enormous amount of construction happening in Vancouver right now. It's pretty hard to not photograph construction there because it's everywhere. And I really do feel construction zones are like a very unique space in the city because, okay, so they have all these different layers of time. So you've got, the past, in the remains of what's there. You've got this suggestion of what's going to be in the future, and you're shooting in the present. So there's this whole like liminalness, I guess, in that space. But personally, I just find them really interesting because I like the shapes and I like the forms. And so when I started realizing I was shooting a lot of construction pictures, I was, kind of coming up with this idea, like what am I doing? Why am I taking all these pictures of construction? Because I knew it didn't have anything to do with sadness about the city that was disappearing or any of the things you might think about when somebody would photograph construction. I knew it was just, I'm responding to the way it looks. And so where I found kind of affirmation for that was not in the world of photography, but the world of painting. And so, Morandi is one of my favorite painters, and you can really see like those bottles up at the top. I mean, if you don't know Morandi's paintings, he painted bottles all his life and lived in a little tiny kind of studio with his 3 sisters, also in Bologna. So that we went to his studio, and I wanted to, so the trash cans there in my neighborhood, I thought, oh, it's Morandi when I saw those trash cans. And so I've got this book here of this construction work, and there's a copy on the back there. They've got a gallery copy you can look at, and they've got some copies at the front desk. I self-published it. I only made 100 copies. I think there's about 20 left at this point at the front desk there. And when I was putting that book together, I really wanted to find a way to get some of the thinking that I had about, how to work with these construction zone photographs into it. So I started putting together these like assemblies of my thought process, and I was calling them field notes. And I imagined them to be, in this book. As it turned out, the book was small, and so these field notes are, too big to fit in the book. There's parts of them in the book at this point. But this, here's the quote about, from Morandi's painting. Someone was right. I often find the critics, when they're talking about somebody's work, there'll be something that somebody says that really just, is exactly what I needed to hear. And so here, Joost Swagerman argues that Morandi did not want his bottles to be viewed metaphorically. They do not form a tacit yearning for something else. They do not even yearn after the shadows they cast. And I think that was, that quote really spoke to me when I was kind of looking around for, this idea of form and being the substance of the photo, of the collages. And so I'll just show you a few of these field notes, just the connections that I have to other artists. Paul Klee is another real favorite of mine, and that image on the top of mine is, I think, I can really see the connection between the watercolor of Paul Klee. I think about Paul Klee when I've done these watercolor backgrounds and the little squares he did. This is a more recent thing with some transformers, not really construction stuff. Maybe a little body of work might evolve out of, that kind of stuff. And then I mentioned Wayne Thibault. You might know Wayne Thibault's paintings of cakes. He's famous for those, but he's done these amazing vertical paintings of the streets of San Francisco. And those paintings, I think, have really influenced me in terms of the way to look at the city from a vertical standpoint. I really like going up on the bridges and, photographing from that point of view. And there was something Wayne Thibault said that I really appreciated as well. He was talking about how he never connected to the other painters around him in the Bay Area when he was doing all these paintings. He was kind of an outlier, but he always did a lot of looking at painters from the past. And so he felt that he was part of a large community, even though, this was all things that had happened before. And I relate to that quote. I look for, I like to read about other artists' lives, and it's affirming to me to hear that other people have had the same, thoughts and things like that. There's a pile of these field notes on the side table there that you're welcome to sift through, and like I said, the book has bits of them. There's some artists that I really like. This is Francis Davidson up at the top. He did torn paper collages and paintings, and I really feel like I see certain things in the city through these prisms of the art I've looked at. So I feel that, my background in art has informed everything in my life. It informs so many things about the way I think about the space of the city. So when I was putting the book together, I also realized that the collages are quite busy, and so I needed to tone them down. And so there's this whole pile of work over here that I'm calling the contour studies, and those are really just very simple portraits of buildings that in Photoshop I've reduced, to black and white, and then done a bunch of, playing around with the shapes of the buildings. And those are portraits of places. I mean, I put the titles of where they are because those are really pretty straight photographs except for the enhancements I've done. Okay, so that is all the slides I have. What kind of questions do you have? Questions? Yes.
Before you create one of these very complicated collages, do you sit with a pad and paper and...
Absolutely not. It's totally intuitive, and that's the part that's really exciting, is because, I have no idea it's actually very similar to street photography in this way, because you go out the door, you don't know what you're going to find. Well, it's the same. I just pull the building in there, and then I start saying, well, what would this look like if I put this behind it? And it's infinite, all the things you can do, and that's, it's very fun to play like that with it. Yeah, no drawing and pre-visualizing ever, really. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a narrative or a story associated with how you make the collages? Or are you just starting with an image and just building?
No, I don't have a narrative and story. Like you would think, that's interesting that you're saying that, because this one looks like it has a story, I think. It looks like it's a fairy tale or something like that. But, I'm not really thinking of it that way unless it's subconsciously. But I always think about the one quote from David Campany when he said, the photograph resides with the viewer. And so I think a lot of people will look at the photograph and have a story, and maybe that's, that's fine. I mean, that's one way to look at art, I think. And so, yeah, I don't really have a narrative in my mind about it. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
I'm curious about your process of taking things out of the camera into the computer and where you're starting and when you're done. It sounds like you're looking at multiple images at a time.
Yeah.
So buildings are speaking to you and you're separating them somehow and not finishing one linearly.
Oh yeah, very much so. I have all these files that are called temporary, and those are temporary 1, temporary 2. They start to really fill up. So like I may have like 12 collages that I've started, sometimes years before, and I'll suddenly like pull them up and see a different connection. Because it's really all about these connections between things. And so, yeah, and then when it's done, I can, that's hard, you know. I still want to fiddle with some of these things always. I'll see things that I could keep doing and keep going. And sometimes actually, you know, sometimes what happens is I'll have a collage and I've been working on it for a long time, and then as the final step, I start closing down the layers so that I can see if I've made a mistake or something. And sometimes I'll remove like a big major thing, like the actual building I started with, and it's like, oh my God, this looks so much better without that building. I need to go find another building, you know. So it's really like a big surprise all the time. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
So from street photography to capture a city to like the abstraction of capture the essence of cities, what makes you, what motivates you into this, like, I think it's a very big conceptual shift.
I'm always trying to figure that out myself. I think, like, honestly, I think all photographers, and the kind of photography I do, I feel, again, David Campany, he calls wandering observational photography. And so when you're doing that, it's like you're always trying to figure out, why am I drawn to this thing? And, you know, and what does that tell me? I think that's just a big question that all artists have. And so I feel like I'm constantly trying to figure that out. I don't know that I have a real clear answer at this point. Yeah, so, anyone? Yes?
Has your street photography taken you away from other forms of photography in a way that makes you feel conflicted?
I think the only problem I have, I am very still interested in street photography, and I will do street photography, but not in the same way I used to, I think. I'm a little bit more inhibited now, and it's interesting because I've noticed that with other street photographers. I belong to this collective in Vancouver. There's 100 of us, and we're all ages. It's really fantastic, and we get together once a month and do photo walks and usually go to a bar afterward and stuff. And a lot of people, I think, start to feel uncomfortable at a certain point on the street, that maybe they're overstepping, and street photography is a confrontational thing in a lot of ways. And so, I mean, I have a 45, my lens is, I can shoot from across the street kind of thing, and I'm really careful about some people are the opposite. They want to engage with the people they're shooting and all of this, but I think that, yeah, the street photography part, I enjoy shooting buildings more because it's slower and less fraught with, like, I don't know, I'm an introvert, which many street photographers are, if you would doubt, but because it's the watching, right? You get to stand and observe. And so, yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's funny because you answered another question that I had that I decided not to ask. I'm just wondering if there's other forms of photography that you'd like to be doing besides street photography that you don't get to pay attention to because you're doing street photography.
Yeah, I shoot a lot of pictures of my family and people like, you know, documentary kind of stuff. And so I took a class this spring through the International Center of Photography in New York. It was a beginning photography class. It's actually pretty fantastic. It's called The Grammar of Photography. Chris Giglio teaches this class. And I was in there, you had to have a project and you had to, you know, shoot for the whole 5 weeks. And there was a accountability. You had to have 12 pictures to put in front of the class every week. And I shot pictures of my family doing kind of, I tried to do pictures that were more documentary than just making my family look attractive like I usually would try to make them look happy, things like this. And yeah, I kind of like that. I like being able to do that, so I've got that thread of things going on as well. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about busy streets and busy cities, because I'm from a busy city, and I always see people as a part of the community. And when you see a crowded street with lots of people doing lots of different things, how do you deal with that with your kind of work? How do you see it differently? How do you put your filters differently?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I find it invigorating to be in a crowded city as well. And I shoot a lot of that stuff. It just sort of lives in the computer often. I'm not as successful with those pictures, but I do like that. I like shooting busy scenes as well. Yeah, so I don't know. Yes?
I just have a comment that I think that I feel this physicality to your work that I really respond to, and I think maybe those years of doing the physical collage, or did you say you
Yeah.
also taught ceramics?
Yes, I did. I did teach some ceramics.
And then maybe the architecture where you walk through the city.
Yeah.
Really aware of things and as objects.
That's great. Thanks. That's a good observation. Thank you. Okay, great. I think people are getting a little itchy. Do you guys want to, ask me questions afterward, but thanks for coming. And yeah, it's nice to see so many people turn out. Thanks. Okay, great.